Hi, I'm Chris from Development. Let's take a look at creating custom server-side APIs using Coronium Core. One of the cool things about Coronium is there's a basic mode which you can use just using the client plugin without even having to write any server code. Or if you want to create more complex data queries, you can use the server-side API and create your own endpoints and utilize the server modules to build more complex applications. And this can also be good for validation and anything that you want to kind of specifically lock down as a specific type of functionality for your application. And you can build these all on the server side and then call to those APIs from the client. So in the guide here, under the server modules in API, there's a lot of documentation here that covers all of the details of how to create an API on the server side. But we'll kind of look at a high-level overview of how to do it here in this video. So the first thing is server-side API is based on what's called a project, and these projects kind of match up to your Corona project. Even though you can utilize projects in your client side, you can point to different projects if you need to call different functionality. But basically, a server-side project matches up with your Corona project. And you can create as many of these server-side projects as you'd like. So the first thing we want to do is log into our Coronium server. And I'm going to use the Coronium user to do that. And once we're inside here, we can pull up the Coronium tool, which shortcut for that is CC. And in here list a couple different things we can do using Coronium here from the command line. And one of the options here is to add a new project. And so that's what we want to start with. So we're going to do sudo Coronium add and then the project name. And in this case we're just going to use test. And it wants our password. And then it gives us a confirmation that the project has been created. So if we want to look at the projects that are currently on the server without having to go through the FTP, we can do Coronium projects, and it shows a list here of what projects are installed on the server. There's a default project that's installed automatically that has a simple little echo function so that you can test the functionality, and then we just added this test project in here. So the next thing we want to do is we want to grab this project so we can start editing the code in there. And we'll do that by using an SFTP program. And I'm using Transmit, but you can also use FileZilla if you want to. And we just log into our server using our Coronium user and then our password. And here in the home folder for the Coronium, there is a couple different folders, and we're interested in the projects folder. And inside here is our test project that we just created. So we're going to go ahead and download this whole folder here. And I have a basic Corona project put together here. And I just downloaded this test folder here. This is our project, our server-side project. I'm going to open up this code. And inside here you can see the extreme basics here for creating an API. Basically, we get a hold of the API object and we localize that, and then we can start adding functions to that API object, and then we return the API object back. And every function we add here, the name of the function becomes the endpoint. So in this case, there is one function here called test, and that is the endpoint for this API, and this simply takes in the input from the client and then pushes the input right back down to the client. So in essence, it's a kind of an echoing function. So to utilize this, when you're using projects, you need to add in an extra key here in your initialization. And so we're going to go ahead and add in our project key, and that will be test. And again, you kind of pair a server-side project with a Corona project. You can call out or switch the project as you're doing code if you needed to cross-reference one, but generally that's not recommended, and you could actually do that, call different cross-project APIs up on the server side as well, which is usually a little bit easier to do. But at its essence here, we just add this project, test, and then now as we call on the plugin side, the core API, we'll be referencing, all our methods will be referenced using this project. Now you also need to have your key, and I'm going to go ahead, I double check to make sure that my key is current because I did reinstall my server between the last videos. So to check your key, you can use Coronium space key, and then you get your key back here, and it looks like that one does match my current one, so I'm good there. And in the client plugin video, I talked about the response handlers. So this is one of the pre-built response handlers that we'll use. If it's got an error, it's going to print an error, and then we're using the core.debug function to just debug the event response, and that will spit it out into as a human readable form into our Corona console. So again, as we take a look at this, this is on the server side. We have this test endpoint, and all it does is echo some data back. So let's go ahead and look at how we actually call that. So the core.api endpoint of the plugin is how we reference our custom-built APIs. And our method on the server side was called test. So we do core.api.test. And then there will be two arguments we would send up with this, and the first one being a data table, which will be basically the values that we send up into the input here. This is a table, and then the response handler. Now, if your endpoint doesn't need any data and it just goes ahead and just spits out a response on its own, you can actually leave off the table for the values and then just supply the listener. But in our case, we're going to send something up because we want to see it echo. So I'm just going to say name equals Jim, and then we need to add our response handler. So once this is done, we should be able to run this Corona project, and it should echo back our data here. It went ahead and downloaded the Coronium plugin for me. As you see here at the bottom in the result here on the debug, it says name equals Jim. So that was successful. It called this test endpoint here on our main Lua up on the server, and then it just spit that right back down in the response. So if we wanted to add other values to this, we can do that, and you can see they get echoed right back to us. So that's the very basics of how you actually put together a little API and then call it from the client side. So let's look at something a little bit more semi-complex, let's say. Let's do a API.add, and we'll take some input here. And in this case, we can start grabbing some values out of this. So we'll take input A, and we'll take input B, and then we'll add these together. And then we'll return this back to the client. So basically, in the documentation, it goes a little deeper into the different response types that you can use. You can actually pass a string, a number, a boolean, or a table back to the client. And so in our case, we're just simply sending back a number, and then this will be part of our result that the client gets back. So we can call this add endpoint here and pass it an A and a B in the parameters table, and then it'll add those up, and we'll send that number right back to the client. So what we need to do is upload this file back to the server, since we just edited it. So I'm going to go ahead and push that back to the server, and that should be up there now. And then down at the client here, we'll go ahead and we'll make some changes here to this call. We're going to first call our add endpoint, and A will equal 23 and B will equal 45. And we'll call our endpoint here. I'm refreshing the Corona project, and you can see our result key is holding the value 68. Now we are using the debug, so it's just giving us kind of a readable form so we can kind of see what the result holds. If we wanted to actually just drill down and extract this value specifically, we would use event.result, and then in our case it was just the result. So this should print out the number as well. So let's go ahead and do that. As you can see, it just gives us the number straight ahead. If we were to pass the table value, then we could obviously drill into the keys on the result here. But the debug method is nice to be able just to kind of get an overview of what the result object is holding. Okay, so one of the other things that is useful is being able to specifically send back an error to the client. and this will end up in the event.error key here. So to do that, there's a special function for that. So let's, for kicks, make sure that the input is a number, and if it's not, then we'll send back an error stating as such. So to do that, we'll just go ahead and do a check on, let's do a type check on input A. Let's say, hey, if it equals this, let's just say if it does not equal a number, then, and then this is how we return an error response. We do return core.error, and then we can just supply it with a string. So we can say not a number. And then, so basically if this doesn't work out, it's going to send back an error, and then it'll skip the rest of this. So let's go ahead and push this back up through our SFTP. And now when we run the project, we should get an error instead of our result. Whoops, got our result still. That's because we're still sending a number. So let's go ahead and just pass something else here. Let's pass a string in the A there, because that's what we're checking, and then we get our error back, and it's not a number. And this is being printed out because here we're print event.error. So that's how we do some error handling as far as returning errors back to the client. You can also utilize any of the server modules, the data files, all these other ones here, in any of your API calls. And in the next video, I'll kind of break this into two here. We'll look at calling one of those modules and returning some data back. But that gives you the basics of how you set up your API, how you call it from the client side, and passing back an error if you need to pass that back. So we'll continue on in part 2 and look at adding some server modules into this API. Thanks for watching.